Wisdom of the Middle Way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakarika. Translation and commentary by J.L. Garfield. Part 2, the text and commentary. Chapter 12, Examination of Suffering. The first of the Four Noble Truths is that all this is suffering. So one can imagine an interlocutor granting all that has gone before, but in defense of Buddhist orthodoxy, insisting that suffering is inherently existent. After all, the Four Noble Truths are, from a Buddhist perspective, truths. Nagarjuna, of course, is a Buddhist and accepts the Four Noble Truths. In fact, the principal chapter of this work, chapter 24, is devoted to an exposition of the Four Noble Truths from the standpoint of emptiness, and to the argument that only on Nagarjuna's analysis can these truths be maintained at all. So he must, without denying the reality of suffering, explain its emptiness. 1. Some say suffering is self-produced, or produced from another, or from both. Or that it arises without a cause. It is not the kind of thing to be produced. These are the four possibilities with regard to inherently existent suffering. The echo of I1 is obvious, and the argument here will depend heavily upon the analysis of dependent arising developed in that chapter and in chapter 7. 2. If suffering came from itself, then it would not arise dependently. For those aggregates arise in dependence on these aggregates. Self-arising suffering would indeed be a candidate for inherent existence. But for the proponent of a Buddhist analysis of suffering, that is little help, since suffering on a Buddhist analysis is the consequence of delusion, attachment, craving, action, and so forth. So such an analysis is not open to anyone wanting to defend the inherent existence of the suffering explored in the Four Noble Truths. 3. If those were different from these, or if these were different from those, suffering could arise from another. These would arise from those others. The next alternative, that suffering arises from another, requires that there be essential difference. For since suffering does arise from previous conditions, if there is genuine otherness, that would characterize the relation between suffering and its grounds. For if suffering were caused by a person himself, then who is that person? By whom suffering is caused, who exists distinct from suffering? But who is that other? It must be the sufferer himself at another stage, or another individual altogether. If it is the person himself, then as the cause of suffering, he must be distinct from suffering. This poses two problems. First, as per the analysis of motion, desire, and agency in chapters 2, 6, and 8 above, we cannot conceive of the sufferer as inherently different from the suffering he experiences. For part of his identity is constituted by that very suffering, and that suffering is his suffering. But second, given the framework of the first of the Four Noble Truths, a Buddhist philosopher such as Nagarjuna would share with any Buddhist interlocutor the assumption that in samsara sentient beings not only suffer, but are literally constituted of suffering, that every aggregate of a sentient being's existence is a cause, an effect, and a basis of misery. So on either score, to distinguish sufferer from suffering for the purpose of such an analysis would be impossible. 5. If suffering comes from another person, then who is that person? When suffering is given by another, who exists distinct from suffering? Another alternative is that the suffering is caused not by earlier stages of one's own life, but by another individual. That other individual, of course, could be someone else entirely, in the ordinary sense, or it could be an earlier moment of what is ordinarily regarded as oneself, but which is for the purposes of this analysis regarded as substantially other. That is, taken in this way, Nagarjuna can be seen to be arguing on each side of a dilemma with regard to the identity of persons across time. But if this were so, it would have to be the case that the person in whom suffering was caused by that other could be identified, and that that person could be distinguished from her suffering. But then the same problems developed above apply. Nagarjuna emphasizes this in 12:6. 6. If another person causes suffering, who is that other one? Who bestowed that suffering, distinct from suffering? 7. When self-caused is not established, how could suffering be caused by another? Whoever caused the suffering of another must have caused his own suffering. But the suffering of that other person must either be caused by someone else, or be self-caused. The former alternative leads to a regress. The whole point from the standpoint of the opponent, who is the target of this argument, is to find the independent explanatory ground for suffering. The second alternative leads back to the problem scouted in the opening verses. Self-caused suffering is both inconceivable within a general Buddhist soteriological framework and runs afoul of the arguments against self-causation generally. Finally, it is rather embarrassingly ad hoc. Nagarjuna sums this up in the next verse. 8. No suffering is self-caused. Nothing causes itself. If another is not self-made, how could suffering be caused by another? But as Nagarjuna points out in 12:9, it can't be caused by both, since we have seen that neither can be causally relevant at all to inherently existent suffering of a kind relevant to Buddhist doctrine. And it is absurd to suppose that it is uncaused. 9. If suffering were caused by each, suffering could be caused by both. Not caused by self or by other. How could suffering be uncaused? 10. Not only does suffering not exist in any of the fourfold ways. No external entity exists in any of the fourfold ways. The fourfold analysis is, of course, that in terms of the tetralemma of causation. And Nagarjuna is simply emphasizing that this refutation of the existence of inherently existing suffering is perfectly general. No entity can arise from itself, from another, from both, or from a non-cause. This was the burden of the first chapter. We must, of course, recall that this is not a refutation of the existence of the suffering we all experience and wish to avoid. Rather, it is a demonstration of its emptiness of inherent existence. For just as the analysis in Chapter 1 has provided the key to dismissing the inherent existence of suffering, the positive side of that same analysis can be used to recover its conventional existence. If by suffering we mean something dependently arisen, impermanent, and conventional, existing only as imputed and only in relation to its empty subjects, there is plenty of suffering to go around. But moreover, not only is the existence of suffering rendered comprehensible on this analysis, but so is the possibility of the alleviation of suffering. For if the proponent of the inherent existence of suffering were correct, while it might seem that suffering would then have a more solid status than that vouchsafed it by Nagarjuna's analysis in terms of emptiness, that very substantial existence and hence independence of other conditions would make its alleviation impossible. For if it exists independently, then there are no conditions in the absence of which it fails to exist. So Nagarjuna's analysis not only makes good sense of the first truth, that of suffering, and by implication of the second, that of the cause of suffering, but also opens the door for an analysis of the third and fourth truths, those of cessation, and of the means to cessation.